There is a sufficient second. Before the question is put to the Senate, the Chair will remind the galleries that expressions of approval or disapproval are prohibited. The question is on the confirmation of the nomination of Clarence Thomas of Georgia to be an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The Clerk will call the roll. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, this will be the last vote this evening. Under a unanimous consent agreement previously obtained, there will be a vote tomorrow on the veto override on the unemployment compensation bill and possibly other votes on appropriations conference reports. Those remain to be worked out. Thank my colleagues.
The Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adams.
No.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Benson. Mr. Biden. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bond. Mr. Boren. Mr. Bradley. Mr. Breaux. Mr. Brown. Mr. Bryan. Mr. Bumpers. Mr. Burdick. Mr. Burns. Mr. Byrd. Mr. Chafee. Mr. Coates. Mr. Cochran.
Aye.
Mr. Cohen.
Aye.
Mr. Conrad.
No.
Mr. Craig.
Aye.
Mr. Cranston. Mr. D'Amato. Mr. Danforth. Mr. Daschle. Mr. DeConcini. Mr. Dixon.
Aye.
Mr. Dodd.
Nope.
Mr. Dole. Mr. Domenici. Mr. Durenberger. Mr. Exon. Mr. Ford.
No.
Mr. Fowler. Mr. Garn. Mr. Glenn. Mr. Gore. Mr. Gorton. Mr. Graham of Florida.
No.
Mr. Graham of Texas. Mr. Grassley.
Aye.
Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatfield. Mr. Heflin.
No.
Mr. Helms. Mr. Hollings.
Aye.
Mr. Inouye.
No.
Mr. Jeffords. Mr. Johnston.
Aye.
Mrs. Cassabaum. Mr. Caston. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Carey of Nebraska. Mr. Carey of Massachusetts. Mr. Cole. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lott. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Mack. Mr. McCain. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Metzenbaum.
No.
Ms. Mikulski.
No.
Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Moynihan.
No.
Mr. Murkowski.
Aye.
Mr. Nichols.
Aye.
Mr. Nunn. Mr. Packwood. Mr. Pell. Mr. Pressler.
Aye.
Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed. Mr. Regal. Mr. Robb. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Roth. Mr. Rudman. Mr. Sanford.
No.
Mr. Sarbanes.
No.
Mr. Sasser.
No.
Mr. Seymour. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Simon.
No.
Mr. Simpson.
Aye.
Mr. Smith. Mr. Spector.
Aye.
Mr. Stevens.
Aye.
Mr. Sims. Mr. Thurmond. Mr. Wallop.
Aye.
Mr. Warner.
Aye.
Mr. Wellstone. Mr. Worth.
No.
Mr. Wofford.
No.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Bond, Boren, Breaux, Brown, Burns, Chafee, Coates, Cochran, Cohen, Craig, D'Amato, Danforth, DeConcini, Dixon, Dole, Domenici, Durenberger, Exon, Fowler, Garn, Gorton, Graham of Texas, Grassley, Hatch, Hatfield, Helms, Hollings, Johnston, Cassabaum, Caston, Lott, Lugar, Mack, McCain, McConnell, Murkowski, Nichols, Nunn, Pressler, Robb, Roth, Rudman, Seymour, Shelby, Simpson, Smith, Spector, Stevens, Sims, Thurmond, Wallop, and Warner. Mr. Glenn.
No.
Mr. Lieberman. Senators voting in the negative: Adams, Akaka, Bacchus, Benson, Biden, Bingaman, Bradley, Bryan, Bumpers, Burdick, Byrd, Conrad, Cranston, Daschle, Dodd, Ford, Glenn, Gore, Graham of Florida, Heflin, Inouye, Jeffords, Kennedy, Kerry of Nebraska, Kerry of Massachusetts, Cole, Lautenberg, Leahy, Levin, Lieberman, Metzenbaum, Mikulski, Mitchell, Moynihan, Packwood, Pell, Pryor, Reed, Regal, Rockefeller, Sanford, Sarbanes, Sasser, Simon, Wellstone, Worth, and Wofford. Mr. Harkin. No. Mr. Harkin, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 52 and the nays are 48. The nomination of Clarence Thomas of Georgia to be Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court is hereby confirmed.
I move to reconsider the vote.
I move to lay that on the table.
Without objection, the motion table is agreed to.
Quorum.
Yes, yeah.